So this particular project has been done collaboratively with my colleague Elena Milani, who works with me at UWE, Marina Joubert, who's been responsible for the work in South Africa, and Michelle Riedlinger, who's been undertaking the work in Australia. And I'm kind of presenting their work on their behalf, as well as my own behalf. So just to kind of explore why we might be interested in communicating, or why we might be interested in looking at cartoons as a particular area of research interest. And aside from the fact that on a personal level, I just find analysing cartoons tremendously fun. I mean, this has to be one of the most fun projects I've had to do in a long time. I think it's worth thinking about some of the other less personal reasons why we might be interested in these as a medium for exploring science communication. Editorial cartoons are typically single image cartoons like the one I'm showing here, and they usually address a single issue. I say usually because there are occasions where maybe they have 2 frames or sometimes a couple of frames, but they do generally address a single issue. They don't, as a rule, feature characters that continue from cartoon to cartoon. So each cartoon is a standalone. There's not like a continuing narrative. Obviously, some characters do repeat. So politicians appear repeatedly in cartoons, and they do look the same across cartoons. They're always drawn in the same way. But there isn't a kind of ongoing story that builds as you look at a series of cartoons. So that's quite different to comics, where there is a narrative that's presented visually that is an extended narrative, and that can be quite important in terms of thinking about what you might expect to see in a cartoon. Editorial cartoons condense that a political and a social issue, or political social issues, into a single visual image, as I mentioned. And these images are normally designed to be easily interpreted by anyone who reads that publication. It can be quite important, that last bit, about reading that particular publication. But they are designed for the audience of the newspaper that prints them. And they are often quite overtly critical of political leadership, as we can see in this cartoon from South Africa, which is quite clearly criticising the behaviour of the ANC leaders compared to what's expected of everyone else. And we're going to see that as a common theme across the cartoons that I and my colleagues have been looking at over the past year. It's also worth remembering that editorial cartoons normally reflect the opinions of the newspaper. I think we recognise that newspapers have political biases, and these are translated also into the cartoons. So that's an important thing to remember when seeking to interpret cartoons. As this quote suggests, political cartoons perform a particular function in terms of exposing ideologies and cultural systems through their look at current events. And some people have argued that cartoons really help people make sense of the world at a specific time. And this is one of the reasons we thought it would be interesting to look at the way in which the pandemic is represented in cartoons across our countries. We also kind of expect that the cartoons about COVID will address events, so perhaps vaccination, perhaps lockdowns, power, so the political angle, and people. And we wanted to see the ways in which these different things coalesce within the cartoons. We hope that by looking at the pandemic through this lens, it might shed some light on the cultural values and the ways in which editorial cartoons might be helping readers to interpret their own understanding of the pandemic. So cartoons, they might comment on current events. However, they might also provide a critical reflection, for example, on the handling, the government's handling or society's responses to a pandemic. And we're definitely going to see some examples of that as we go through the presentation. In terms of wider research in this area, there's research that's looked at news representations of the pandemic and associated lockdowns. And by and large, these have found that news reports do focus on the political dimensions rather than on health or scientific angles. And I think that's also interesting in terms of cartoons, so we'll come back to that at the end. Other research has looked at cartoons and the way in which the virus has been portrayed. So my colleague Marina Joubert has looked at cartoons in South Africa and particularly the portrayal of the coronavirus in those cartoons. But we haven't seen any studies that have looked at the relationship between the political and the health and scientific dimensions of the pandemic. So that's one of the things that we're hoping to pull out in our study. And as I mentioned, other research has looked at comics and comics as much larger narrative items are quite different. But this study by Saji, they argue that comics are a good medium for presenting information and potentially for educating publics about health. They've looked at graphic medicine, which is a particular kind of platform and project designed to use comics as a communication platform. But I would argue, or I would put in the caveat that because they're multi-frame and they have a story to them that's more, it's like a comic book, they're quite different to editorial cartoons. And so I think we're interested to see whether or not there is any education that might be going on within these cartoons. Why an international comparison? Well, the COVID pandemic has affected all regions of the globe, but it hasn't affected us all equally, nor has it affected us all at the same time. And so there is both a global and a local dimension to our exploration of cartoons. And we really do anticipate that there will be differences between Australia, South Africa, and the UK in the way that the pandemic is portrayed. I think we all recognise that Australia, for example, has gotten off relatively lightly in relation to the pandemic, owing to quick and strong government action, versus the UK, which I would put on the more severely affected end of the spectrum. So what did we set out to do? First of all, we set out to explore how cultural, political, and editorial contexts influence the COVID-19 discourse in these newspaper cartoons in the 3 countries that we looked at. I will focus a little bit more today on the data from the UK. But I will present data from all 3 countries. And just to kind of give a bit of a focus here, or a bit of an illustration of some of the challenges, but also the opportunities of looking at cartoons from 3 different countries. I've picked out 3 different cartoons that illustrate really 3 different aspects of this process. At the top, we have a cartoon from the Australian. And you'll see in this cartoon, and just in case the text is small, how dare that dumb, orange-skinned, redneck, narcissistic Seppo insult the Chinese like that. Now, on the face of it, that looks like a criticism of Donald Trump. However, in conversation with my colleague in Australia, Michelle, it transpires that Australia has a really difficult relationship with China. China is a major trading partner for Australia. On the other hand, Australians have a big problem with Chinese human rights. And so there is a sense in which Australia wants to criticize China, but has to walk a really fine, very difficult line between criticism and maintaining that trade partnership. So this is kind of an oblique way of criticizing the Chinese by sort of doing it by apparently criticizing the US. If we look at the cartoon on the bottom left, which says a corona outbreak, first responders, you may remember that at the start of the coronavirus outbreak, Australians were accused of loo roll hoarding, which then led to runs on loo roll in other countries, including the UK. And that's clearly what's being referenced in this cartoon from the City Press. And finally, the Sunday Telegraph, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. But this cartoon is referencing Boris Johnson's impending illness. Well, he's ill at this point, but he's not yet in hospital. I think he's not yet in hospital at that point. But importantly here, we have a reference to Churchill. And this kind of war theme, but also the kind of the Prime Minister as the Churchillian figure, is something that crops up on multiple occasions in the Sunday Telegraph. So we see there are kind of consistencies in presentation as we go through. But I think sometimes these are all things that are not necessarily easy to pick out in each other's contexts, because perhaps, you know, those sorts of references aren't culturally resonant in other countries. So we did find it really difficult looking at each other's cartoons when we were doing our coding comparisons, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But it was really enjoyable to look at those cartoons and to learn about the ways in which this pandemic was represented differently across the countries. Other thing I forgot to mention was these cartoons are all taken from Sunday, the 22nd of March, which is the day before the UK goes into lockdown, and that's the reason I picked this as a set just to look at for this part. So what about our approach? We used a content analysis approach. We looked at 2 Sunday newspapers from each country, so 6 newspapers in all. That was 7 cartoonists. The Sunday Telegraph has 2. We tried to get both a sort of left-wing and a right-wing newspaper from each country. We were a little bit limited in terms of what newspapers we could access the cartoons from through the various platforms our libraries had to allow us to access newspapers online. Obviously, we couldn't go in and collect newspapers from the libraries as we might have done otherwise, so we had to rely on online sources. We undertook to code a sample of cartoons. All 4 of the people involved in the project coded a sample of cartoons from each country to get a sense of our intercoder reliability. We achieved a good intercoder reliability on all bar 1 code, and that final code was one which required that sense of being able to, you know, to recognize each other's politicians and some of the local nuances, so that there's one code which is really much more qualitative in its nature, but the rest of them were quantitative codes. We started out with a plan to collect cartoons from the beginning of January 2020 right through to the end of December 2020. But at that point in the UK, there was still a tremendous amount of COVID-19 related cartoons coming in, and they were all starting to talk about vaccination. So we decided we would carry on collecting cartoons to the end of June. Since we haven't reached the end of June, we've clearly not finished data collection at this stage. So what I'll present today is data that looks at the whole of 2020 when I'm looking at all 3 countries. And then in a couple of cases for the UK data set, I've extended it to the end of March to allow us to think about the first parts of the vaccine rollout. What did we find? Well, the first thing that's really striking is that there is quite a difference between these 3 countries in the percentage of cartoons that have COVID-related content. COVID content can be the primary message, or it could be a secondary theme within a cartoon. But when we just looked at, you know, how many of the there are 51 or 52 cartoons for each of these papers, so there's about 300 cartoons in the data set. How many of those have some sort of COVID content? And as you can see, it's pretty similar between Australia and South Africa at around about 50%. Much more in the UK at around 85% of the cartoons having some sort of COVID related content. So looking just at the UK, how does that vary across the time of year? So here we have data. Purple is the Sunday Telegraph, blue is the Observer. At the lower level are any cartoons that have some sort of COVID content. So it could be that they have it as primary content, or it could be as secondary content. And the top line is those cartoons that don't have any COVID content. So not surprisingly, in January, in February, when this pandemic is still kind of largely confined elsewhere, it's not really quite got to the UK at this stage, we don't exactly see a lot of cartoons with COVID content. Actually, there's only one, and that's in The Observer. But as soon as we hit the end of February, so this is after the February half term, when lots of people came back from Italy with COVID-19 and started spreading it around the UK. And at that point, we suddenly start to see practically all the cartoons in these two newspapers have COVID-related content. And there's it should be a little bit of a blip in sort of October, November, when there are a few cartoons that reference the US presidential election. There's a couple of cartoons around that time, particularly in The Observer. And then as we get into the early part of January, The Observer took a small break, but the Sunday Telegraph has continued, and practically all the cartoons, even right up through the end of March, have had some sort of COVID content. Just for reference, if we look at the overall figures across the 15 months, so given that we've got 2 months at the beginning of the year, that's where we don't have a lot of COVID content, but when we look across the whole 15 months, 65% of the Observer cartoons had some sort of COVID content, and 71% of Sunday Telegraph cartoons had some sort of COVID content. So it's really dominant in the UK. If we think about then, of those cartoons that have some COVID content, is COVID the primary theme, or is it a secondary theme? And I'll come on to explain the difference between primary and secondary in a moment. And here you can see that there's a lot of similarity between Australia and the UK. If you're going to cover COVID, they're going to make it the main theme most of the time. But in South Africa, it's very often not the primary theme. So, and particularly in the Sunday Times, COVID is often represented with other political issues and may in fact not be the primary theme within the cartoon. So here we have an example of how COVID might appear as a secondary theme in a cartoon. The only real reference to COVID-19 in this cartoon is the face mask. So COVID is in some respects used as a metaphor for other problems within the government. So here Cyril Ramaphosa is being criticised for communications, for his leadership, etc. And COVID-19 is just one of the things in that mess of different challenges that he faces. We can contrast that with this cartoon, which shows a picture of the South African coat of arms. This is one of the few cartoons in the entire data set that has explicit educational content in it. So the small text in this, it first says don't panic, then it says wash your hands and no physical contact. So in terms of text, that's one of the few places where we've seen that. On just below that cartoon, you can see the actual South African coat of arms, and I'll just mention that the text on the actual coat of arms says in the Khoisan language, diverse peoples unite. So there is a kind of message here about unity as well that's going on in this particular cartoon. In Australia, things are different, I suppose. You would not be surprised. Here is an example of a cartoon where the COVID content is secondary. It's from the end of March. And what we have here is explicit criticism of the Prime Minister for a campaign which is called Stop the Boats. And this campaign, which you can see in the small picture in the bottom left, I Stopped Bees, is a campaign to stop refugees from coming into Australia. So the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, created a border force who dress as the people in the cartoon, and their job was to stop refugee boats from coming in. But instead, the country was letting in these cruise ships, which were a significant cause of community transmission of COVID-19 in Australia. So that cartoonist saying, yeah, we're going to let in the people who are exposing us to COVID-19, but we're keeping out all these small boats with refugees on it, and referencing that particular campaign. In contrast, here we have an example where we have some COVID content as the primary message. Again, we have Donald Trump. He does appear quite regularly in Australia. And you can see, you know, he's not paying any attention to the disaster of the pandemic that's falling around him. So lots of little COVID-19 bombs dropping around President Trump. In the UK, particularly in the Observer, when COVID was a secondary feature, and you'll remember COVID was more often a secondary feature in the Observer. Well, I might not have shown you that yet. Anyway, in the Observer, Brexit is a big issue. And we see here an example where actually the cartoonists are saying, Boris, you're focused on the pandemic, but you should be thinking about this elephant in the room that you're not dealing with, which is the Brexit issue. So this is from April of last year, so before Brexit happened. And it's notable that that this is a theme that, as I say, crops up again and again in Chris Riddle's cartoons. Here from July, we have another example which brings together both Brexit and the coronavirus pandemic. And we have the end of lockdown at around this time, but it's this cartoon is saying, well, you might be ending lockdown, but we've got no idea where we're going as a country, what's going on. At the bottom, just below the lion's nose, you'll see the no deal Brexit sign. So Brexit is in there, but we've got a second wave. We've got a road to recovery that's not going anywhere. We've got world-class test and trace. So it's sort of criticizing everything that's going on at that time. I said at the beginning of this presentation that characters don't repeat as a rule in cartoons. There is an exception in Chris Riddle's cartoons in that the Brexit elephant, the British lion or the English lion, and Britannia are frequent characters in the cartoons, but the story doesn't carry on. So the principle is the same. The story doesn't continue throughout, but these characters keep reappearing, which I thought was kind of interesting. It doesn't happen to the other cartoonists. Primary versus secondary content, which I just sort of jumped ahead on a minute ago. You can see from this graph that there is a difference between the Sunday Telegraph and the Observer. The Observer is much more likely to have COVID content as a secondary message, and a lot of that is to do with Chris Riddle's almost obsession with Brexit, because that appears in an awful lot of cartoons. Whereas with the Sunday Telegraph, it's most often the case that Brexit is the primary theme, and that's carrying on really at this point, even into this year. When we did our analysis, we looked to see what the broad framing of the cartoon was. So we split this down into a broad frame, and then we did do a secondary frame analysis, but today I'm only going to present the broad overarching frames. And we were looking to see what sort of general areas the cartoons were aligning with. And as you can see, for all countries, the main area in which the cartoons were kind of active was in a category we labeled politics and government. So this is cartoons that are overtly criticizing political actions. This was particularly true for Australia and the UK, where they really are the dominant theme, a little bit less so for South Africa, which it's worth noting was the most diverse of the countries in terms of the different themes that we identified. So we had politics and government as the most common theme, and economy and health being generally common themes across all countries, with the exception of the Sydney Morning Herald, which didn't cover health. But what was interesting was that in South Africa, COVID-19 could be framed within the context of crime, media and communication, and science and research, and those themes didn't appear in any of the other countries. Education was a theme that only appeared in the UK, and I do need to double check, but I'm pretty sure that that was pretty much fully associated with the exams fiasco of August last year. Other things to note, that Australia had relatively little focus on health. It did have a small amount of focus on army and police, which was a theme that didn't appear at all in the UK. So there are definite differences in terms of the broad themes that appear across these different countries. There was only one cartoon in the whole data set that tackled science as a primary theme. Science appeared sometimes as a secondary theme, but as a primary theme, there was only this one cartoon from South Africa, which appeared at the end of December 2020. You can see from the image here that there is a representation of viral spread in the graphic. But we thought what was really interesting about this cartoon was Santa's holding a vaccine, a bottle of vaccine. And we interpret this as not only is this about the spread of the virus, but it's also about the spread of the vaccine and the extent to which that spread might be fair in the way it's rolled out. And fair means, in this context, on a global level. So I think that's a really sort of prescient reference to a lot of the debates that are going on at the moment about the COVAX scheme. Because we're in the UK, I thought it's worth just briefly looking at the education cartoons. So we've got one from the end of May, one from the middle of August, and as you can see, overtly criticising the government, but in particular, the government's handling of education. And worth noting here, because I'm going to come on and talk about politicians in just a minute, that we have on the left Boris and his sidekick Dominic Cummings, and on the right we have Boris and Gavin Williams. Boris appears in an awful lot of cartoons, and he may be represented with other politicians, as in this case, or as we've seen earlier, on his own. But I think this sort of sense of Boris as stealing your future, or in the case of the pirate, or as just sort of letting the other politicians to kind of go ahead and take the fall, as you get in the cartoon on the right. I think that's quite common across both cartoonists, but particularly the Sunday Telegraph. They give Boris quite a hard time. We looked to see what politicians were present, and you can see here that broadly, whether politicians are present is fairly similar across the papers, with the exception of the Australian, which has a lot of representation of politicians, and I'll explain that in a later cartoon, and the Sunday Times of South Africa, which has a relatively low representation of politicians. We also then wanted to understand who those politicians were, and you can see here that in the UK, they are generally, about half the time there's a politician present, it's Boris. Whereas in the other countries, there's a much broader spread of politicians that are present in those cartoons. And in Australia, they tend to be state governors that are represented in the cartoons, as well as the Prime Minister. In South Africa, it's a really broad mix of politicians, including Nelson Mandela, and a whole range of different ministers and past politicians. Past prime ministers and so forth. So current prime ministers were not a core feature there. We also just noticed and thought it would be interesting to analyse the presence of Donald Trump. He doesn't appear in the Sunday Telegraph, but he appears in all other papers at least once in relation to COVID-19. I think he appears in all papers in relation to the US elections. But I think it's just interesting that, the Sydney Morning Herald just seemed to have a bit of a thing for Donald Trump, as did the Sunday Times of South Africa, but a bit less in the UK. So here we have two ways in which political leaders might be represented in cartoons, both those that are present and those that are absent. So on the left, a cartoon from South Africa. is suggesting that Cyril Ramaphosa is doing a relatively good job at managing a COVID pandemic. Boris is on the phone saying, I need to talk to a real president. And, you know, he's got Donald Trump there and Bolsonaro, neither of whom have really handled the pandemic very well. So here we have an example of how through criticism of others, you know, your politicians, your local politicians are presented in a slightly more positive light. I also thought it was interesting that Johnson and Bolsonaro have labels and Donald Trump doesn't, suggesting, you know, who's got wider visibility on the global stage. Not surprising, but interesting. On the right, we have an example of how the Sunday Telegraph is representing Boris as a savior, and perhaps also implicitly that Brexit has been a good thing in this particular case. So Boris is speeding away with his supply of vaccine, while in Europe we see still ongoing infighting and sort of criticisms of how slow the vaccine rollout has been. So Boris and Ursula together in the same picture, so multiple politicians again represented, but in a broad theme around the pandemic, either the handling of the pandemic or the handling of vaccination. We looked at visual elements to see what was similar, what was different. So we looked specifically at the presence of a virus, a face mask, or death and mortality. And again, I think interesting differences between newspapers, although perhaps not between countries. I think it's quite interesting that the Sydney Morning Herald represents the virus a lot and hardly ever shows a face mask and doesn't ever show representations of death and mortality. I think it's also interesting in the UK that there is rather more representation of death and mortality than in the other countries, although the virus is relatively less represented and face masks about the same. And this is at least partly owing to the Observer. I think Chris Riddle likes to draw pictures of death. So there are quite a lot of pictures of death in those cartoons. So again, these are looking at only those cartoons where COVID is present. So an example of how face masks and viruses might be represented, here we have a cartoon from The Australian, where we can see the virus on the lady's skirt, the face mask on the lady, but not on the politician. The V stands for Victoria. And the politician is the Premier of Victoria, Dan Andrews. Now, The Australian is a right-leaning newspaper, and the Premier is a Labour politician. He was responsible for mandating that for Australia anyway, very long and unpopular lockdown in Victoria, which essentially eradicated community transmission in Australia. Opinions are divided, as you can imagine, but The Australian, being a right-leaning newspaper, was sympathetic of the federal government, which is the Liberals, a more conservative party. And I think, you know, as with perhaps the US and the UK to an extent, lockdowns were quite unpopular with more right-wing leading parties. And so here, the Premier is seen as the bad guy, holding the entire state to in kind of as hostage to this virus. What about vaccination? We looked at vaccination only so far in the UK, but you can see two very different kind of ways in which vaccines are portrayed here and also in the slide with VSS Ursula. Here we have on the left the Sunday Telegraph being quite critical of Johnson's rollout of the vaccines. This is in January, the point at which Boris has announced that he's going to change from the boosters at 2 weeks to having a 3-month separation between doses of vaccine in the UK, contrary to all other countries. But in particular here, we see the cartoonists suggesting that, yeah, we've got plenty of vaccine, but we've got no way to distribute it. So it's a criticism of the lack of planning on behalf of the government around the vaccine rollout. In contrast, we have, again, Chris Riddle and Brexit. Here we have Boris as the Easter Bunny who's got a vaccine and he's ending lockdown. So things are all looking up. He's the Easter Bunny and he's ignoring this stinking Easter egg at the back, the Brexit Easter egg, which looks like it's maybe about to explode. So again, that sort of tongue-in-cheek, okay, things might be looking good, but actually we're not really looking under the surface to see what the issues are that the government needs to be addressing, focusing only on the immediate concerns. So I'll just sum up. I've just got a couple of summary slides here. I think the first thing to say is that we found cartoons to be a really interesting window on political representation of the pandemic in the countries that we looked at. And the difference was really quite interesting between these countries and the way that the cartoonists are presenting the pandemic. That's probably not surprising. I mean, it's a politicized field. Editorial cartoons are squarely political in their remit. So that's perhaps not surprising. But I think the different ways in which the pandemic has affected those countries is also at play here. So we have a bit more work to do to kind of really unpick that. I think the other thing that we were perhaps a bit surprised about was the relatively little evidence we had of cartoons with scientific or health content in them. They have elements related to public health in the sense that there might be a virus or a face mask. But beyond that, there really wasn't any kind of discussion of, for example, the scientific evidence of around lockdown or around particular behaviours. It's really much more about those more political, social decisions. You know, it's economy, it's governance. It's not where does the science fit into this. So I think we found that perhaps a little bit surprising. Other things that we've learned, well, very importantly, those cartoons really do need to be read in the context of the politics at the time and the country of publication. You can't just pick up a cartoon and read it. You need to know about that country, their politics, and even the politics of the newspaper to an extent to be able to understand those cartoons. They do, however, provide a really interesting window onto the way in which the pandemic has been represented at a global and at a national level. So I think for us, this has been a really interesting opportunity to share the different ways in which politics has affected the visual representation of this issue. Clearly, the pandemic competes with other political events in the eyes of cartoonists, and that's more evident in other countries than the UK. It really has been the dominant issue in the UK for the past year, or the pandemic and Brexit between them have been the dominant issues, and so other aspects of policy haven't been critiqued in the way that we might expect in a more normal year. So I'd like to just leave it there, open the floor to questions, but I did just want to leave you with the cartoon that for me represented the pandemic the best. And here we are in a talk where normally, you know, I might expect to come and see you, but that's opened up the opportunity to speak to people who aren't based in Bournemouth. But we're talking through a screen. So we are in some sense alone together.